Some of you know me. I'm Brian Moriarty. I was a software engineer at Airbnb for 5 years, from 2015 until the layoffs in May of 2020. I was talking recently to a friend of mine. Our kids have gone to school together since elementary school, and he is a certified financial planner. We talked about the fact that Airbnb might have an IPO either this year, cross your fingers, or in the next year or two. And he was telling me some things that employees and ex-employees might want to know to understand their tax consequences and make the most of their equity. So I asked if he would give a talk to all of you Airbnb alumni. And he said, sure. Just so you're all aware, this session is being recorded, and the link to the video will be put into the Air Alumni Slack channel when it's ready. And so without further ado, here is Tom Lowe.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Brian. Let me just make sure on a couple of logistical things. First of all, are you guys, Brian, you're seeing me as primary? I just want to make sure it's showing up that way.
It's showing everybody on my screen because I set it to grid view.
Okay. All right. Well, anyway.
I can just change it.
You guys,
yeah. Change it to speaker, and then if you're, as long as you're talking, then I see primarily you. Yeah.
Okay, great. So everybody, thanks for joining. Especially appreciate it during this kind of weird time. So I'm going to get briefly, as Brian said, into some slides, but I do want to. I did want to start with first of all, thank you for joining at this time, because as I know, it is, as we all know, it's an odd time. And in particular, I was thinking about this conversation, and in preparation, maybe a month or so, because I'm meeting groups like this on a regular basis and clients, I, about a month or two ago, needed to get a haircut, because I get one every month or so, and realized I didn't have that many options because I'm in San Mateo County. So looked around, and then actually thought about driving a few hundred miles to get a haircut, and then decided I'm going to go local. And so I went to the person with the most haircut experience locally in my house, and that was my 16-year-old son, who has cut his own hair. So he had experience of one time, and then he cut my hair. So I just wanted to let you know that this is what you get. But appreciate it, because it's a crazy time like that things like that are happening. So let me first share some slides with you. Let me make sure. So is everyone seeing the slides? Thumbs up? Okay, great. So let's start talking. So as Brian said, I'm gonna take you guys through how you can best prepare for the Airbnb IPO. So let's get going here. So just quick disclaimer, what I'm gonna do is provide general information here. Each of your specific situations may be different. So I'm gonna give you a framework to think about it, but for your specific situation, you wanna make sure you understand what that is, what your goals are, before you make decisions around that, okay? So quick look at what we're gonna cover today. So we are going to, I'll just give a quick bit about my background to help you understand why I'm here today. And then the primary goal is to talk about the taxes on your equity after the IPO, how to think about that. And then secondly, how to make the most of your equity after the IPO. And that's minimizing taxes and making the most of what you have. And then we'll talk about next steps. And then also, we will talk about, we'll open up for Q&A. So that's general Q&A. And what I want to do there is, some people, I've done this a number of times. Some people are comfortable asking questions in that forum, and we'll have you just put them into the chat box as we go through. but I have found that some people prefer to do it in a smaller setting. So I was talking to Brian, I'm going to block out some time on my calendar tomorrow and Thursday afternoon for some slots exclusively for Airbnb alums. If you guys have questions, you just set up a one-on-one session with me, and I'm happy to talk to you. And I'm actually gonna put in the chat box quickly the link. So this is a link to my calendar, so you can schedule. Let me just do this quickly, pull this up. Okay, so let me get into my chat.
And Tom, for those Airbnb alumni one-off consultations, are those, is there a fee for those?
No, it's free.
Great.
Okay. So, all right, so I just put it into the chat, so if you click there, then feel free. All right, so let's get back to our slides. Okay, so actually just quick, this is my background. The reason I'm here today, I'll just share a personal story here. So I used to work in tech, Silicon Valley. I worked at some startups. I actually worked at a .com in the late 90s during the .com bubble. And so I had some incentive stock options at this .com, and the .com I was at had their IPO, and during the lockup, the stock reached $125 a share, and I was young. I thought, wow, that's really good. So I ended up, when the lockup ended, the stock was at less than $25 a share. And so what I, at that time, realized is I said, you know what? It was at $125 a share. It's got to be worth at least that. And so what ended up happening, as you know, as you look back on history, the .com bubble burst. So my company that I had the stock in actually shut down, and I held all of that stock until it went to nothing. And so I learned an important life lesson, and that was, hey, I really need to understand how this equity works. I didn't really understand how the ISOs worked. I talked to my colleagues, a lot of them didn't understand. I said, I need to educate myself about that. And I also realized that there was a clear need for help with Silicon Valley tech professionals with their equity, because there's quite a bit of complexity around this, especially with taxes. And so I said, you know what, I'm going to educate myself. And in the end, I built this firm to do exactly that. That is, it's focused on helping tech professionals with their equity. And so that's why I'm here today also, is, again, to help educate people so that they don't necessarily go through what I went through. So that's why I'm here. Here's what I want to talk about. We're going to start by talking about the tax implications of your equity, all right? And I'm going to focus right now on restricted stock units and Airbnb shares, because I think that's what most people have. However, if you also have non-qualified stock options or incentive stock options, then I would love to hear. But what I want to do is take a moment, if people will put into the chat box what they want to hear about or what they have, so that I can focus the conversation around that, that would be greatly appreciated. So yeah, if you guys just put into chat any feedback, hey, here's what we're, RSUs, okay. One NSO, so almost everybody is RSUs, a couple of NSOs. Okay, stocks. Okay, so it looks like mostly RSUs. So we'll talk about that. We can touch on NSOs, and we'll we'll also talk about stock. Okay, great. It's very helpful. Thank you. So let's start. RSUs. Most of you have this, so I'll make sure we focus on this. So here's what's happening with your Airbnb RSUs. The basics, this is compensation you got in the form of company stock, and it vests whenever you meet the vesting requirements. Now for Airbnb, you have double trigger vesting, which means you need to meet 2 requirements before you vest. The first one is you vest over time, right? And if you guys are all alumni, you've already done that. And typically, you know, that's a 4-year vesting schedule, but that's the first part. So you guys are there. So then the second part that has to happen before you vest is you need to have an IPO or liquidity event. Okay, so once the IPO happens or there's a liquidity event, that means you're going to vest that day. Okay, so what that means for you is tax-wise, the day you vest, which will be IPO date for our purposes, you're going to owe ordinary income tax on the fair market value on that date. Okay, so whatever value you have in your RSUs on that date, it's going to count just like you got paid in salary, right? You're going to pay ordinary income. And so typically what happens is, and again, this varies by company, but I would expect withholding is at 22%, which is withheld for federal taxes. And the way it typically works, again, varies by company, but typically what Airbnb will do is they'll sell enough RSUs to cover the withholding, and then you get the shares that are left over. So quick example is you got 1,000 RSUs, stock's at $100 a share. So that's a fair market value, $100,000 on the IPO date. Company sells, they withhold, let's say ballpark 300 RSUs or $30,000 to cover taxes, federal, state, and Social Security, Medicare. And then you get the remaining 700 RSUs or $70,000. You own those RSUs and you can sell them, okay? So that's how it works. That's how I expect it would work. So there are some things to be aware of, okay? First one is you will likely be under withheld, okay, for taxes. So you want to be aware of this. So if they withhold you at 22%, the federal tax rate goes as high as 37%, right? So if you get, let's say you happen to get $1 million in RSUs, you're going to be likely at the highest tax bracket, right? So they're under withholding you as much as 15%. So the example would be if you got 10,000 RSUs, $100 a share, that's $1 million on the IPO date, counts as ordinary income. They may withhold, let's say, just for purpose of this, they withhold 22%, so they withhold $220,000 for federal taxes. But since you're in the 37% bracket, you actually should have been withheld for $370,000 worth, which means the company's under withheld you $150,000 for federal taxes. So you owe those taxes. You owe $150,000, and you need to set it aside. So what has happened to me, a number of my clients is they'll have RSUs, they get withheld, and they think, oh, I'm good to go, right? They've withheld my taxes, come to tax day, and they owe a lot of taxes because they've been under withheld. So that's the first thing to be aware of. You want to know what your taxes are going to be, and you want to make sure that it is withheld. Okay. Now, specifically, what you should do to prepare for this IPO is some companies, and this is something you'd have to ask Airbnb, is it's possible to withhold at a higher tax rate. Okay. So, for example, Slack. So I have some clients there, when they had their IPO, they gave employees who were going to have more than $1 million in equity a choice to withhold at a higher rate at 37%, right? And so you could choose to do that, and if you did, they sold more, they withheld you, and you were good on your taxes. So if Airbnb gives you the choice to do that, then you should choose what the appropriate higher tax rate is. And if you don't know, you figure out yourself. If not, you talk to a tax person. You should also figure out if it's possible to withhold. You calculate your actual withholding and you estimate, okay, here's the tax reserve I'm going to need, right? Again, hire a tax person if you don't know. They can help you calculate that, because you owe, just to be clear, you owe those taxes. You're going to have to pay them come April, even if you don't have the cash. Now, what I recommend is, if you have the choice, and we'll talk about this in a moment, to sell immediately, set aside for taxes, and then you should be good to go come April. Or if you can't for some reason, then try to set aside cash to fund that tax reserve. Okay. Now, so let me tell you a quick story here. I have a client at Slack. She had the option to withhold at a higher 37% tax rate. She said to herself, well, we're talking on Zoom just a few days before the IPO. She had to make this choice. She said to me, you know what, I want to withhold at the lower rate because I think the stock's going to go up a bunch. Then I'll sell it later. I'll have to sell less, and then I'll pay my taxes. And I said, well, keep in mind, if the stock drops, then you're going to have to sell more to pay the taxes. And she knew that going in. So when Slack IPO'd, they were at roughly $38 a share. And so she withheld at the 22%. Rest of the year, come April, stock was in the 20s. So her tax bill came. She ended up having to sell a lot more stock to pay the tax bill, which was the risk she took, which is why I say to you, I recommend selling the RSUs immediately, just because you know you got to pay the taxes. So that's what could happen. Now, the question that I already heard some feedback through Brian on, and you guys may be asking is, well, what if we can't sell the RSUs immediately because we're locked up, right? So it's common to have a lockup, 6-month lockup for shares for insiders, employees. So this all depends. This is all Airbnb's call. It depends on when they decide to deliver the shares, right? This varies by company. As an example, Uber, they delivered the shares on IPO date. So employees, insiders got the shares. They vested that date, and they were all locked up for 6 months. And the problem with that was they IPO'd, the stock price was about $45 a share. When the lockup ended, 6 months later, it was about in the 20s. So they were already down 20-something bucks a share, but they still owed the tax on that higher amount. So what I suggest you do as early as you can is estimate the tax reserve that you're going to need. If you're locked up, then see if you can identify other ways to fund the tax reserve, because you're going to have to pay the taxes. And then also develop a selling plan for when the lockup ends, so that you know, okay, if I can't pay it through these other sources, or I can pay part of it, this is how I'm going to fund it. Okay? So that's not a great solution, but that is kind of the solution that is available. Now, I have, everything I've read indicates that Airbnb is leaning towards doing a direct listing. Slack did a direct listing, and Slack also, because they did the direct listing, they had no lockup period for their employees. So everybody on IPO date, even employees, could sell. So if Airbnb does a direct listing, potentially they won't have a lockup, but that is all under Airbnb's control. But you guys should keep posted on that, and because you're going to need to make decisions based on that. Okay, so those are our issues. I want to talk about stock. And stock, those of you who have stock, you exercise either ISOs or NSOs in the past. And that, once you exercise those, then you got, in turn, stock. So the past tax consequences, which you may have gone through, is which you would have gone through for ISOs. You may have been subject to alternative minimum tax when you exercise, and then for NSOs, you may have been subject to ordinary tax, income tax when you exercise. Now that's in the past, unless you happen to do it this tax year. If you do it this tax year, then it would be for this tax year. So what that means is if you have stock, right, you exercised options in the past, you're not going to owe taxes on IPO date like those who have RSUs are. You're going to owe taxes only when you sell, okay? And so it's different from RSUs. When you sell, that's when you owe taxes. And the way you calculate your taxes is you figure out your cost basis, which is how much you paid for the stock, typically your exercise price. And then you're going to pay capital gains on the difference between the cost basis and your selling price. And if you've held the stock more than a year, then you pay a lower long-term capital gains tax rate, which goes up to 20%. If the stock is held less than a year, then you have short-term cap gains, which goes all the way up to 37%. So, quick example is cost basis is $10 a share. You sell it for $110 a share. Your capital gains is $100 a share. So if you've held it greater than a year, you may owe up to $20 a share for federal taxes. If you've done it less than a year, it could be up to $37. And then in terms of preparing for the event itself, what I recommend is that you develop a selling plan so you can maximize the value of your stock and minimize the taxes. And so, for example, minimizing taxes, you could spread the tax over multiple years. You know, if it happens this year, you can put it into 2020, 2021, or as many years you want. But instead of having to pay it in 1 year, you keep yourself at a lower tax rate because you spread it out over multiple years. And again, each time you sell it, what I recommend is estimated taxes are for that sell, and then set it aside immediately in cash. Okay, so that is the stock. And then I want to, since somebody mentioned NSOs, I want to briefly talk about NSOs. So, the NSOs, non-qualified stock options, just the basics are that it's a right to buy the stock but no obligation. When you are granted the NSOs, nothing happens, no tax implications. But as soon as you exercise them, so if you have NSOs now and you haven't exercised them, you're going to pay ordinary income tax on that spread, the difference between whatever your strike price is and the fair market value. And if it's publicly traded, that's the share price. If it's not, it's the most recent 409A valuation. So if you have NSOs, there is an opportunity to optimize the taxes, meaning you can ideally time it in a way which is going to minimize taxes, or exercise them in a way to do that. But there's quite a bit of it's entirely dependent on your individual circumstances, so I can't, it's hard to give general advice, but the takeaway is you can do something to minimize your taxes, to optimize your taxes with NSOs. But for those who still have them, I'm assuming you have a limited 90-day window if you left recently. Okay. So anyway, that's just a quick thing on NSOs. Let me go back to okay, let's talk about, so we talked about taxes. So you guys have a sense of that. Let's talk now about how to make the most of your equity. And the other thing I should mention, the goal here is to wrap this up in about 30, 35 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A after that. So let's say you have your stock, IPOs happened, and you have the ability to sell either immediately or after the lockup ends. Here's a way, a framework for thinking about how to sell your stock. So step one I would think about is sell immediately to cover any near-term financial goals, right? Any valid near-term financial goals. So number one there would be tax reserve, right? You got to cover taxes because you already own. Other examples would be an emergency fund. If you don't have one, you want to build one, that's something you should do. Or if you want to buy a house in the next, say, when I say near term, really less than a year, and you know you want to buy a house, you need a down payment, go ahead and take it out in cash. Because you want those things in cash because they're near-term needs. You don't want it in a volatile single company stock that could drop a lot, because let's say you have your down payment, stock drops in half, it's still in the stock, then your down payment is now in half. Maybe you can't buy the house. So that's why I say figure out what your near-term needs are, take the money off the table. Okay, step two. If you, if you're a big believer in Airbnb for the long term, and you want to hold some, many of my clients believe in their companies, they want to continue to hold, then I think that's fine. You just need to decide, okay, how much do I want to go ahead and keep for the long haul? I suggest you keep it something like 5 to 10% of your holdings, but you need to make that decision. Okay, I'm willing to hold for the long term because I believe in the company. You take that, you carve it out. Step three is you want to develop a holistic plan so you can decide, okay, how much of this value from Airbnb am I going to need to achieve my goals? And those goals could be, okay, how much do I need to make work optional to get to financial independence? Longer term goals like, okay, how much am I going to pay for college? So anything like that, you want to figure out up front, because the equity is going to give you a way to get you there. And I'm not trying to make this, it sounds pretty simple as I've described it here, but this could be, if you can figure it out on your own, great. If you can't or you don't want to, then this is what I do. Hire a financial planner, because sit down, lay out your goals, quantify the goals, and put together a plan to figure out how to get there and help you understand how can the equity help you get there. Once you have this plan, then the next step is develop an actual selling plan. Okay, how am I going to execute on selling this? And so let me give you a quick example. I have a client I worked with. He was at a biotech company. We started working a little before the IPO, and we were able to do a couple of things. One was just minimize. He had a bunch of ISOs and NSOs. We minimized taxes, optimized his taxes, because we were over a couple of tax years, and then we put together a very clear selling plan. Here's how we're going to sell. And he knew if he sold those, he was going to be able to make work optional, pay for college, and buy a house. Those were his goals. If he could get that value out, then he would be good to go. So his IPO happened. He was locked up. His lockup ended in mid-March. So this was when all the craziness was happening. Fortunately, we had met, we were talking on Zoom prior to that, and we agreed on the plan. We locked it down so that as soon as the IPO happened, as soon as the lockup ended, he was able to sell in the first few days, and he got out all of the value he needed to achieve those goals he wanted, right? Now work is optional. He's got college funded. He's got a house. And so that is, that's the benefit of preparing sooner rather than later, because there's this window of opportunity if you want to minimize your taxes and you want to make sure you get the goals that you want to with the equity, then kind of the sooner the better. So that's why it's good we're having this conversation now before anything has happened versus after the IPO. So those are kind of the high level recommendations. When you think about, so I want to get a little deeper into the selling, what's that look like? So when you talk about selling, kind of the high level ways to sell are, you just sell immediately, as soon as you can sell immediately, or scheduled selling. And so what that means is, the reason you might want to think about selling immediately is, this is data from Wealthfront. It's a couple of hundred IPO tech companies. This is showing you on the x-axis if you had different strategies, and they varied by how often, over how many quarters you sell your equity. You could sell it immediately, 0 quarters, and you could sell it as much as over 16 quarters, selling 1/16 every quarter for 16 quarters, and everywhere in between. And then this on the y-axis is annualized regret. And so what they did is they looked at what's the ideal selling scenario, and then how much regret, meaning how much did you lose for these different strategies. And what you see here is, takeaway is, the best strategy was to sell immediately. The worst strategy was to hold indefinitely, and the longer you held in general, the worse you did, the more regret you had. So if, for example, you believe this data, it makes sense to you, you may say, I just want to sell it all. Simplifies my life. Now, most of my clients don't want to do that. And so then what I suggest is scheduled selling. You just sell your shares over time. The benefits are you aren't going to pick the single wrong day, right? It's a low point. And you also have more control of your taxes. You can spread it out. So a couple ways to do this is, you could sell, if you do scheduled selling, you say, I just want to sell 10% a quarter over the next 10 quarters. And what this does is it puts it on autopilot. You don't have to worry about, okay, is the stock up or down? I'm just going to do it and not think about it. I know I'm not going to get the lowest price. I'm going to get some higher, some lower, but it'll work out in the end. So that's a very simple way to do it. Another version is you sell the shares based on your price ranges. So you can say, for example, all right, we're in $100. I'll sell 75%. Between 75 and 100, I'll sell 50%. Less than 75, I'll sell 25%. So this helps you sell more when it's higher, sell less when it's lower. And you just do this every quarter until all your shares are sold. Okay, so these are ways to think about selling that may be helpful to get you there. All right. So we covered the taxes. We talked about how to make the most in selling these. So now let's take questions. And so first, again, I mentioned the 30-minute one-on-one sessions. Tomorrow, 9 to noon, Thursday, 11 to 1. You go here to this URL and you can just put on my calendar. One last thing I want to share with you quickly is just a personal story I had, which you'll see how it relates, which is a few years ago, my wife asked me to, we had some bees in the back, beehive. So she asked me to go call up the exterminator to get the bees, to get the beehive removed. And I said to her, I go, you know what, that's simple, I can do that myself. So went out in the back, removed the beehive, started to, and the next thing I know, I had a bunch of bees on my head, and I in fact went I have to admit, I was running and screaming, and I ran into our house trying to get help. It turns out our screen door was still closed, so I ran right through the screen door. And the only way we fixed it was I ran back outside. My wife hosed me down, and we got rid of the bees. But the takeaway for you guys is when you want to do something that's important, it's good to hire some, and it's something you haven't done a lot. Like, I'm going to remove bees one time in my life. That's the last time. Hire a professional. They're doing it every day. They can make sure it's done right. So Some of you may be comfortable doing this yourself. If so, that's great. Hopefully this is helpful. But if not, you want somebody to help you, then that's why I'm here. So let's start. So thank you, everybody. Let's go to questions, and let me take a look at the chat to get there. Let's see here. So here is.
I think the first question was around 12:14 p.m. by Katie Schmidt. And then there's a bunch of good questions below that.
Okay. So Katie's question is, does Airbnb also withhold for California? Does it mean they're not sufficiently withholding? Okay, so, and where's the tax money due that's not withheld? Next, when is the tax money due, not withheld? Next tax deadline. Okay, and then Katie's saying, as far as she knows, they won't hold at the higher tax rate. Did anyone else hear differently? So to answer the question, typically they will also withhold for California. Again, you want to check the withholding rate to make sure that it is high enough, because you'll probably be at you could be at the highest rate. They may, which is 13.3%. They may hold. I think they typically hold at 10%, but it's not as big a deal. And then the tax money is due. Again, it depends on your specific tax situation. There's something called a safe harbor, meaning if you withhold, say, 110% of your taxes from last year, this year, then you're okay. If not, then you need to pay estimated taxes, which are, it would be the first, I believe it'd be the first quarter after your after the IPO. So you need to check if you're covered by the safe harbor. If you're not, then the taxes, and if you are, then you would pay come April. If not, then you would pay estimated taxes with the next quarter. Okay, and I'm not a licensed tax professional, so you need to talk to a tax professional to make sure that you should check with them to make sure that in your specific tax situation. Okay. Okay, so let's see. If Airbnb has an IPO December with a 6-month lockup, can't sell shares till 2021 after taxes due, what then? Okay, so the answer then, if that happens, is you can't, you have to, well, I guess the options are your taxes are due, you don't have the cash. So either you find another source of funding for the taxes, and that could be, you know, potentially near-term source until you sell the equity. Or you could also choose to defer, well, none of the options are really good. You can defer your tax returns, but you're still going to have to pay interest on whatever taxes you owe. So you're going to either have, you got to pay the taxes come April 15th. If you don't pay them, then you're going to have to pay some penalty until you can pay them. Or, you know, the better alternative is to find some alternative source of funds to pay the taxes. Now, the other thing that comes to mind is, well, yeah. So there's not a good answer for that, unfortunately. Okay, let's see. Oh yeah, and sorry, Phil Snow said, yeah, you can set up a payment plan with the IRS. That's actually a good point. You can do that, but you still have to pay interest on that. So just be aware. Okay, so disaster scenario. Okay, sorry. Okay, 6-month lockup under withheld tax. Airbnb goes bankrupt, stock goes to zero within the lockup. Do we still owe that under withheld tax? So, the answer is, so you'd have to pay the taxes come April, but then you would be able to get a capital loss, which you can then use to offset gains, which over time would likely make that up. So the short answer is come April, you got to pay it, but then you have to, but then you would get it back because you'd be able to take a capital loss. Okay, so hope that answers that. Okay. All right, Brendan, equity incentive plan suggests we do not vest on IPO date, says liquidity is satisfied on either the earlier first quarterly installment after the 6-month anniversary effective date of an IPO or Feb 25th of the calendar year following the year in which the IPO was declared effective. So this is the first time I've seen this language. So this is saying after the 6-month lockup, first quarter after that, or Feb 25th calendar year following. So as I mentioned up front, everything is company specific. What I described to you is very typical. If this, and this again, the first time I'm seeing the language, if this is in fact the case, then this is saying that you're vesting the quarter after the lockup ends or Feb 25th calendar year after. So if it IPO happened this year, it would be Feb 25th of 2021. So Brendan, I don't know if this is what everybody has, but what I suggest you do is look at your paperwork or have someone look at your paperwork who can tell you here's how it works. Okay, no 90-day window. Okay. Okay. Okay, so, and sorry, I just want to do a quick time check. It's 12:45. I'm happy to stay on a little longer. If others, if you need to go, then feel free. But I'll stay longer. Brian, are you okay staying longer?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay. Okay. So this says company required to tell employees about an IPO less than 30 days. Do you know former employees get the same timing or even less notice? So I don't know how former employees are treated. I actually, well, I guess my expectation is once somebody inside knows that you guys will know in about 30 seconds. But I don't know what the legal requirement is. I would be, I think it typically applies to shareholders, so I would think that you would get notified. Okay. If you have, Jennifer asked, okay, if you have capital loss but no future U.S. income, can you get a refund? Okay, so no, the answer is no. Losses need to be used. You can use $3,000 to off. They need to be used to offset gains, capital gains. You can use up to $3,000 a year against ordinary income, but if not, then you can carry it over. Oh, here it is. Somebody is saying that. Yeah, there's a carryover of you can carry it over until you use it up. Okay. So after you pay the initial amount in taxes, what are the long-term tax implications if you don't sell all the stock? Okay, so I think what you're asking is, all right, you pay, let's say you pay the RSUs, then it is if, I'm assuming you're talking about RSUs, let's say today you vested, the RSUs were $100 a share, you're going to pay taxes on that, and then it's as if you bought Airbnb stock on the IPO date, you paid $100 for it. It's treated exactly the same if you vest, meaning that if you go $100, it's just the gain from that date. If you go a year or more, greater than a year, you pay long-term capital gains tax. If it's less than you pay short-term. And so a year, if you're a year and a half from now and it's $150, you pay taxes on that $50. And whether it's, if it's greater than a year, you pay long-term. If it's shorter, you pay short-term. Okay. Okay, so Julius asked, all right, just confirm, spreading the tax over a few years was an option only for ISOs and NSOs, not RSUs, and that is correct. RSUs, again, when they vest, you owe the tax on that date immediately. There's no choice about spreading it out over multiple years. Okay. All right, and so that's all I'm seeing. Anyone else? Any other questions?
I have one. This is Brian again. There was something you mentioned to me briefly the other day about if you wanted to maximize charitable contributions after an IPO.
Yeah. Sorry. So if anybody is charitably inclined, meaning you want to donate to charity, and you have stock, this would apply to those who have stock versus RSUs. If you have stock that has, it's called highly appreciated stock that you've held more than a year, and you want to donate, there's something called a donor advised fund, okay? And the way it works is donor advised fund. So normally if you, let's say you wanted to donate and you had stock. So let's say you got $100,000 worth of stock, you sell the stock, you're going to pay, let's say $40,000 in taxes on it. You get $60,000, you take the $60,000, you give it to a charity. So you get to give $60,000, charity gets $60,000, and you get a tax deduction for $60,000. The better scenario is this: if you have highly appreciated stock greater than a year, you donate $100,000 to a donor advised fund. Okay. You then, I'll explain in a moment, but it's a vehicle to donate. It gets in the donor advised fund, then the charity gets $100,000. You get a tax deduction for $100,000 because you don't have to pay the taxes. And then it sits in this donor advised fund, and then you can choose to give that out over time. You just say, hey, I want to donate to this nonprofit or this organization, and they will cut a check to that organization. And meanwhile, it's invested, and you can have it as long as it lasts. But the tax benefit is you get the tax deduction in that single, whatever tax year that is. And so if you happen to have a big income year, like an IPO year, it makes sense to do something like this, because you get the tax deduction when it has the most value, meaning your tax rate is the highest possible, and you don't have to pay taxes on those and you're able to donate to charity, they get more, you get higher, you get more out of your tax deduction. So that's called a donor advised fund. So if you're charitably inclined and you have stock, that's a great way to do it also. So thanks for reminding me about that, Brian. Okay, I think we're good. Thank you everybody for joining, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. And then, oh, also, sorry, I should have mentioned, we're going to have a recording of this and slides. I'll have Brian post it to your group, and then anybody who wants it can get it. Okay? Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks everybody for coming.